Hey, my name is Owen Callahan. I'm 31 years old and I teach adult swim lessons at a community center on the east side of Raleigh, North Carolina. Most of my students are people who decided later in life that they were tired of avoiding the deep end at parties or the hotel pool on vacation. I like the job. It's quiet, structured, and no one expects me to be anything other than competent and patient. 6 months ago, my 4-year engagement to Lauren Whitaker ended in the living room of the apartment we were about to leave. There was no affair, no screaming, just Lauren standing near the half-packed boxes, looking at me like she had already made the decision days earlier and was only now saying it out loud. "I think we're really good on paper," she said, "but I don't think this is love anymore." I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to stay or list the reasons we should try harder. I just nodded, packed the rest of my things that weekend, and moved into a one-bedroom place closer to the community center. After that, my life became deliberately simple. I taught. I went to the gym. I cooked the same 3 meals on rotation and ate them alone at the small table by the window. I told myself the quiet was rest. Most days I almost believed it. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early March when everything shifted. I had just finished a beginner's class and was pulling the lane ropes in, coiling them slowly so the water would settle. The pool was empty except for the low hum of the filtration system and the leftover chlorine smell that always clung to the air after a long day. I heard footsteps behind me, then a woman's voice. "Do you teach adults who are actually terrible?" I turned around. Diane Whitaker stood at the edge of the deck in dark jeans and a cream sweater, her dark hair pulled back the way it always had been at family dinners. She was 52, divorced for years, and in all the time I had been engaged to her daughter, she had been kind in a distant, polished way. She never needed anything from anyone. She arrived on time, left at a reasonable hour, and never spilled anything on herself. Seeing her here asking that question felt like the floor had tilted slightly. I set the rope down. "Diane." "Hello, Owen." She gave a small, careful smile. "I know this is strange." It was more than strange. I had not seen her since the engagement ended. We had exchanged a brief, polite text when I moved out, and that had been the end of it. Now she was standing in the place where I spent most of my waking hours, asking if I taught people who were bad at swimming. I dried my hands on a towel. "You don't swim?" "I've avoided it my entire life." She glanced at the water like it might answer for her. "When I was 7, I slipped off a dock at a family cabin. No one noticed for a few seconds. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. I've spent 45 years making sure I never had to be in water deeper than my knees." She explained that a close friend had invited her to a lake house the following month. The friend had already rented kayaks and planned afternoon swims. Diane said she was tired of letting an old fear decide what she was allowed to do. She wanted to learn enough that she wouldn't have to sit on the porch while everyone else got in the water. I almost told her I could recommend another instructor. The words were already forming. Teaching Lauren's mother felt like crossing a line I hadn't known existed until that moment. Diane seemed to sense it. "Is it because I'm Lauren's mother?" she asked quietly. I didn't lie. "Yes." She nodded once, as if she had expected the honesty. "I understand, but I'm not asking as her mother. I'm asking as someone who is finally tired of being afraid." I looked at the empty lanes, then back at her. Something in the way she stood, shoulders slightly tense, hands clasped too tightly, made the decision for me. I told her we could start with a private lesson the next evening. The first session was gentle. I kept her in the shallow end, water only to her waist. Diane held the edge of the pool with both hands like it was the only solid thing in the room. She hated the feeling of water near her face. Every time a small wave from her own movement touched her chin, she flinched and apologized. "I'm sorry, I know I'm being ridiculous." "You're not," I said. "You're scared. That's allowed." She looked at me for a second longer than necessary, then nodded. We worked on floating with a kickboard under her chest. Her legs were stiff at first, but she listened carefully and adjusted when I corrected her. By the end of 40 minutes, she could float for several seconds without panicking and kick a short distance while holding the board. When she stood up again, water streaming down her face, she was breathing hard and smiling in a way I had never seen at any family dinner. "Can I try a little deeper?" she asked. "Just once." I hesitated, then agreed, staying close enough that I could reach her in one step. The bottom of the pool began to slope near the 5-foot marker. Diane pushed off the wall the way I had shown her. For a few seconds, she did everything right. Chin up, slow kicks, arms steady. Then her foot slipped on the incline. The water rose past her shoulders before she could correct. Her eyes widened. Panic moved through her body faster than thought. She lunged toward me, her arms locked around my neck, hard. Her body pressed against mine as she tried to climb higher than the water would allow. I felt the full weight of her fear in the way she held on. I put one arm around her back and the other under her arm, keeping us both upright. "I've got you," I said, voice low and steady. "Look at me. You're safe. I've got you." She was shaking. I kept talking, repeating the same words until her breathing slowed. When the panic finally eased, she didn't let go right away. Our faces were only inches apart. Water dripped from her hair onto my shoulder. I could feel her heart still racing against my chest. The fear in her eyes changed into something quieter and more complicated. Awareness, then confusion, then a recognition neither of us wanted to name. I became very conscious of where my hands were, of how close we stood, of the fact that this woman had once sat across from me at Thanksgiving and asked if I wanted more stuffing. The glass door at the far end of the pool deck opened with a soft metallic sound. I looked up. Lauren stood there in a dark coat, one hand still on the door handle. Her eyes moved from her mother's arms around my neck to my face and back again. The expression that settled on her features was not loud. It was the quiet kind of shock that arrives when the world rearranges itself without permission. Diane felt the shift in my body and turned. The moment she saw her daughter, she released me at once, stepping back so quickly she almost lost her footing again. I steadied her by the elbow without thinking, then let go. Lauren's voice carried across the empty water. "Mom?" I stood in the pool, water up to my chest, and watched the three of us freeze in place. Whatever simple life I had built in the last 6 months had just ended. I could already feel the complications gathering, heavy and inevitable, the way deep water waits for anyone who steps too far from the wall. Lauren stepped fully onto the deck and let the door close behind her. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft slap of water against the tiles and the distant hum of the pumps. Diane moved first. She put a careful distance between us, wiping water from her face with both hands as if the motion could erase what had just happened. Her cheeks were flushed, not only from the cold of the pool. "I was taking a lesson," she said. Her voice stayed even, but I heard the effort it cost her. Lauren's eyes moved from her mother to me and back again. "A swim lesson with Owen." The way she said my name made it sound like an accusation. I climbed out of the pool, water streaming down my legs, and reached for a towel. I kept my movements slow on purpose. Anything sudden would have made the moment worse. "She's doing well," I said. "Better than most beginners." Lauren opened her mouth, then closed it again. I could see her trying to decide which question to ask first. Before she could choose, I spoke again. "The lesson's over. Diane needs to change and warm up. You and I can talk another time if you still want to." She stared at me. In the 4 years we were together, I had almost never cut a conversation short. I used to smooth every rough edge, absorb every silence, make sure she left feeling settled. That habit had ended the day she told me we were only good on paper. I was not going to pick it back up now. "Not today," I added, quieter but firm. Lauren looked at her mother one more time, then turned and walked out the same door she had come through. The glass shuddered slightly when it closed. Diane stood in the shallow end, arms folded across her chest, even though she was still in the water. When I offered her a hand, she took it, climbed the steps, and accepted the towel I held out. She wrapped it around her shoulders and kept her eyes on the floor. "I'm sorry," she said. I frowned. "For what?" "For that. For Lauren walking in. For putting you in the middle of something awkward." I waited until she looked up. "Why are you apologizing for someone else's reaction?" The question landed harder than I expected. Diane's mouth opened, then closed. She didn't answer right away. We walked in silence to the small seating area outside the locker rooms. A vending machine hummed against the wall. I bought 2 hot chocolates and handed her one. The cup was thin and already starting to soften from the heat. We sat on a metal bench that still held the day's chill. Diane held the cup with both hands and stared at the steam for a long time before she spoke. "For most of my life, I've been someone's something," she said. Tom's wife, Lauren's mother. After the divorce, I became the woman who used to be married to Tom. Even when people were kind, that was the frame they put around me. I can't remember the last time I did something only because I wanted it, without checking first whether it would make anyone uncomfortable. She glanced at me. Signing up for these lessons is the first decision I've made in a long time that feels a little foolish on purpose. I knew people might think it was strange. I did it anyway. I nodded, giving her room to continue if she wanted. She didn't. Instead, she asked a quieter question. When Lauren walked in, were you embarrassed? No. The answer came out immediately. Then, before I could stop myself, I added the more dangerous truth. I just didn't want her to make you feel like you'd done something wrong. Diane looked at me for several seconds. Something shifted behind her eyes, small but clear. I felt it too. The careful distance I had kept between us for years, polite family dinners, polite conversation, polite interest, suddenly felt thin. I realized I was no longer seeing her only as Lauren's mother. I was seeing Diane, a woman who was intelligent, dryly funny when she let herself be, and more uncertain than she usually allowed anyone to notice. I liked the way she listened. I liked that she didn't fill every silence. I liked the simple fact of her presence on that cold bench, holding a cheap paper cup like it mattered. The recognition unsettled me enough that I pulled back. We should keep this strictly instructor and student, I said. It's cleaner that way. Diane nodded at once. Of course, you're right. We both pretended the agreement solved everything. It didn't. From the second lesson onward, the boundary became harder to hold. Diane progressed quickly. Fear still showed in the tightness of her shoulders whenever water reached her collarbone, but she pushed through it with a stubbornness I respected. After each session, we found ourselves talking longer than necessary. First, it was about breathing technique. Then it became about other things. I learned she used to paint, landscapes mostly, and had stopped almost 20 years earlier when life got too full of other people's needs. She learned that after Lauren left, I had spent months wondering whether I was the kind of man who was solid and reliable, but never quite someone anyone wanted to stay for. We never lingered on the painful parts. We just set them down between us and kept talking. One evening in the third week, she managed nearly a full length of the pool using only a kickboard for balance. When she reached the wall, she was breathing hard, hair plastered to her forehead, and smiling with pure, unguarded pride. Without thinking, she reached for me and pulled herself into a brief, tight hug. There was no panic this time, no slipping, no need for rescue. Both of us felt the difference the moment her arms closed around my shoulders. She went still. I went still. The water lapped quietly around us. Diane loosened her hold slowly and stepped back. A small, self-conscious laugh escaped her. I guess I can't blame not being able to touch the bottom this time. I smiled, but the smile didn't reach as far as it should have. Neither of us pretended the moment had been harmless. Something had shifted again, and we both knew it. The instructor and student line we had drawn was still there, but it no longer felt like protection. It felt like a thin piece of tape holding together something that was already coming apart. The next lesson ended the way the others had. Diane climbing the steps with water still running down her arms, a towel already waiting in my hand. We stood near the benches while she dried her hair. Neither of us mentioned the hug from the previous session. The silence around it felt deliberate. She folded the towel carefully and looked at me. Would you want to get dinner? She asked. Not to talk about technique, not about Lauren, just dinner. I should have said no. The reasons lined up quickly in my head. She was Lauren's mother. She was more than 20 years older than me. If anything happened between us, Lauren would feel it as a betrayal, even though our engagement had already ended. The cleanest path was to keep the relationship exactly where we had agreed it should stay. I almost gave her the safe answer. Then Diane spoke again, quieter. I've spent too many years asking other people what I'm allowed to want. The sentence landed with more weight than any dramatic confession could have. I heard the years inside it. I heard the careful, accommodating woman who had sat at the head of the table during every holiday dinner and never once asked for anything for herself. I heard the cost of that habit. All right, I said. We chose a small taco place near the river, the kind of restaurant with mismatched chairs and paper napkins. There was no pool, no deep water, No excuse that required us to stand close or hold on to each other. That absence made everything feel more intentional. We sat at a corner table. Diane ordered without hesitating, which surprised me. In the past, she had always deferred, asking everyone else what they wanted first. Tonight, she simply chose. For a while, we talked about ordinary things: work, the changing weather, a book she had started reading. Then the conversation drifted into heavier territory without either of us forcing it. Diane told me about her marriage, 24 years with Tom. It had not been cruel. There had been no single moment of collapse. Instead, there had been a long, quiet pattern of putting his preferences and Lauren's needs ahead of her own until she could no longer locate the person she had been before the roles took over. When the divorce finally happened, she said, the strangest part was realizing how much of her identity had been borrowed. I listened. When it was my turn, I told her the truth I had not said out loud to anyone else. The worst part wasn't that Lauren left, I said. It was the last few months before she did. I kept trying to be more of whatever I thought she needed. More patient, more ambitious, more interesting. I started measuring myself by whether I was still worth keeping. Diane watched me over the rim of her glass. You always tried to become what people needed, she said. I met her eyes. And you? A small, tired smile touched her mouth. I became what people expected. The recognition between us was quiet but complete. We had spent years performing different versions of the same mistake, living as useful versions of ourselves instead of actual ones. Sitting across from each other in a noisy taco restaurant, we both saw it clearly. After we paid, we walked along the river path. The air was cool, streetlights threw broken reflections across the water. Diane kept her hands in her coat pockets. I kept mine at my sides. The space between us felt charged in a way the pool never had, because nothing about this evening could be blamed on fear or necessity. She spoke first. I noticed you, she said, before, when you and Lauren were still together. I never let the thought go further than a second. It would have been wrong and I knew it. But the thought was there. I stopped walking. She stopped with me. I never looked at you that way while I was with her, I said. Not once. I need you to know that. Diane nodded. The relief in her expression was subtle but real. Whatever was happening between us could not be built on a betrayal that had never occurred. That mattered to her, and I understood why. And now? I asked. She looked at the dark water for a moment before answering. Now I'm trying to stop lying to myself. I stepped closer. When I kissed her, it was careful at first, giving her every chance to move away. She didn't. Her hand came up and rested against my chest, not pushing, just present. The second kiss was surer. I felt the years of restraint in the way she held still and then, slowly, leaned in. When we finally separated, her forehead rested briefly against mine. Don't turn me into a mistake tomorrow, she said. I won't. I meant it. The next morning my phone rang while I was making coffee. Lauren's name filled the screen. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Her voice was tight and controlled in the way it always became when she was hurt and trying not to show it. I know, she said. About you and my mother. There was no point pretending. The evening by the river had ended the possibility of keeping anything quiet. I sat down at the small kitchen table and waited for whatever came next. The simple life I had built after the engagement ended was already gone. What replaced it would depend on how honest the 3 of us were willing to be. Lauren wanted the 3 of us in the same room. She called Diane that same morning and asked if we would come to the house. When Diane told me, she left the choice open. You don't have to be there, she said. Do you want me there? She was quiet for a moment. Yes. We drove separately and arrived within a few minutes of each other. The Whitaker living room looked the same as it had during every holiday dinner I had ever attended. Neat, carefully arranged, the kind of space that always felt prepared for company. Today, it felt smaller. Lauren stood near the fireplace with her arms crossed. She looked at her mother first, then at me. So it's true, she said. You're actually seeing each other. Diane didn't look away. I'm getting to know Owen. Lauren's face tightened. From her perspective, the situation was simple and unacceptable. The man she had planned to marry was now stepping into her mother's life. She turned on Diane first. You're betraying me. The words hung in the air. Diane's shoulders drew inward for half a second before she forced them back. Lauren shifted her attention to me. Is this some kind of payback? Because I ended things? No, I said. She studied my face as if she could catch a lie. Then she asked the question that had clearly been sitting in her for hours. Did you want my mother when we were still together? No. The answer came without hesitation. I respected her. I was loyal to you the entire time we were together. Nothing between Diane and me started until after we were completely finished. Lauren shook her head. There are millions of other women in this city. Why does it have to be my mother? Diane spoke before I could. Because for most of my life I made every decision based on what you would think, or what Tom would think, or what the neighbors might say. I love you. That has never changed. But loving you does not mean handing you the right to decide who I'm allowed to care about. Lauren's voice rose. You're choosing my ex-boyfriend. No, Diane said, still quiet. I'm choosing a man after you already chose to leave him. The room went still. Lauren looked at me as if she expected me to fill the silence with an apology or an explanation that would make the situation easier to reject. I didn't try to win the argument. I only said what felt true. You're not an object Diane took from you, and neither am I. Something in Lauren's expression shifted. The anger remained, but underneath it I saw a more complicated recognition. Seeing you with her made me realize I still felt like I had some claim on your life, she said. Even though I was the one who ended it. I don't even know if I want you back. I just never imagined you would end up connected to another part of my family. The honesty cost her. I could see that. It also landed heavily on Diane. She looked down at her hands, then at the floor. Maybe we should stop, she said. At least for a while, until things settle. I didn't argue. I also didn't reach for her. If she stayed with me only to prove a point to her daughter, it would eventually damage both of us. If you choose me, I said, I want it to be because you want me, not because you're pushing back against Lauren. Diane nodded once. We left the house without touching. The lesson stopped. The short messages in the evening stopped. There were no more paper cups of hot chocolate on the cold bench outside the locker rooms. The pool felt larger without her laughter carrying across the water. I went back to the routine I had built after the engagement ended: teach, gym, cook, sleep. But the quiet no longer felt like rest. It felt like absence. I understood something important in those weeks. I was not missing the excitement of something forbidden. I was missing Diane. The way she listened. The way she worked through fear without performing bravery. The particular silence she kept when she was thinking. Diane, from what little I later learned, reached a similar conclusion from the opposite direction. Ending things did not restore peace to her family. It only returned her to an old pattern, giving up what she wanted so that someone else could feel comfortable. The familiarity of that pattern no longer felt like safety. It felt like disappearance. 3 weeks after the conversation in the living room, I was coiling the lane ropes at the end of the day when I heard footsteps on the deck. I looked up. Diane stood at the far end of the pool, hands in the pockets of her coat. She didn't smile. She simply looked at me the way she had the first time she asked if I taught adults who were truly bad at swimming. I'd like to continue the lessons, she said. I set the rope down and wiped my hands on a towel. Just swimming? I asked. Diane held my gaze without looking away. No. Diane returned to the pool the following week. This time she did not ask Lauren for permission, and she did not try to hide the lessons. She told her daughter the truth in a single conversation. She was going to keep learning, and she was going to keep seeing me. She did not demand approval. She only asked for respect. The months that followed were not easy. Mother and daughter spoke carefully around each other. Some dinners ended early, some phone calls stayed short. Lauren needed time to sit with a reality she had never imagined, and Diane refused to shrink herself to make that process faster. Slowly, the sharpest edges began to dull. Lauren eventually had to admit what the facts already showed. There had been no secret relationship while we were engaged. No one had lied to her. No one had set out to hurt her. The timeline was clean, even if the outcome was uncomfortable. One afternoon, she asked to meet me alone at a coffee shop near her office. She sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a cup she barely touched. The part I hate most, she said, is that the two of you look happy. I didn't answer. There was nothing useful I could say. Lauren stared at the table for a moment, and I know that doesn't give me the right to ruin it. It was not a blessing. It was not forgiveness offered cleanly. But it was the first honest step she had taken toward acceptance, and I recognized the cost of it. Diane changed in quieter ways. She started painting again, small canvases at first, then larger ones that took over a corner of her dining room. She went on a weekend trip with two friends she had not seen in years. She signed up for a pottery class she had talked herself out of a decade earlier. Most importantly, she learned how to say no without immediately apologizing for the shape of the word. I changed too. I stopped trying to become the most convenient version of myself in order to keep someone close. Diane never asked me to fix her life or prove my worth through constant usefulness. She simply wanted me present. That turned out to be harder and more valuable than any of the performances I used to offer. 6 months after she came back to the pool, Diane swam the length of the deep end alone. I waited at the far wall. She stood at the opposite end, adjusted her goggles, and pushed off. No kickboard. No hand reaching for mine. No flash of panic when the water deepened beneath her. Her stroke was still imperfect, but it was steady. When she reached me, she grabbed the edge, pulled herself up, and laughed through heavy breaths. I did it. You did, I said. She moved closer in the water until we were face to face. Then she put her arms around my neck the same way she had on the first day. The gesture was identical. The meaning was not. I glanced down. The water reached only to her collarbone. Her feet were firmly on the bottom. You know you can stand here, right? Diane smiled. I know. Then why are you still holding on? She drew me closer until there was almost no space left between us. Because this time, I want to. She kissed me in the middle of the pool, unhurried and certain. A year later, we are still together. Not everyone understands the choice, and we stopped needing them to. Lauren and Diane needed many more months before their conversations stopped circling back to me out of habit or hurt. Eventually, they found a workable rhythm again. They can sit through an entire dinner now without the air growing tight. We never tried to turn what we have into a story about love conquering every obstacle. We simply lived. We went to work. We cooked. We argued about ordinary things and then resolved them. We swam. Diane kept painting. I kept teaching the adults that fear of water does not mean they are incapable of learning to move through it. Sometimes, when I watch her cross the deep end by herself, I still think about that first Tuesday afternoon. She had clung to me because she could not touch the bottom and believed she was going under. I thought my only responsibility was to keep her above the surface. I understand it differently now. Both of us were learning the same lesson in different ways. There is a wide distance between holding on to someone because you are afraid of sinking and choosing to stay with someone when you are finally able to stand on your own.